Camping alone was supposed to be peaceful. That was the whole point. Get away from the noise, the people, the suffocating city. Just me, the fire, and the open night sky. I had picked a remote spot far from the main trail, a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches swaying in the night breeze. The only sounds were the crackling of my fire and the distant hoot of an owl. It was perfect. As I sat by the fire, stirring the embers with a stick, I felt it, a shift in the air, like the forest had exhaled. The fire flickered strangely, and for the first time that night, I noticed just how dark it was beyond the ring of light. Too dark. That's when I heard it, a footstep. Not a deer, not the rustle of some small animal, a human step. Slow, deliberate. Hello? My voice sounded weak. The fire popped loudly, and in that brief burst of light, I saw him. A man stood just outside the fire's glow, tall, thin. His clothes hung loose like they belonged to someone else. His face was barely visible, shadowed by the brim of a hat. He wasn't carrying a backpack, no gear, no flashlight, just standing there. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low, even, almost too calm. I swallowed hard. "Where'd you come from?" He shrugged. "Been walking for a while. Saw your fire. Mind if I sit?" Something in me screamed no, but the rational part, the polite part, hesitated. He didn't look dirty, didn't look lost, but something was off. The silence stretched too long. He was still waiting for an answer. The fire crackled between us, casting jagged shadows on his face. "Yeah, sure," I said finally. My own voice felt distant. He stepped forward slow and easy and lowered himself onto the log across from me. The fire lit his face for the first time, and I realized, with a sudden, stomach-dropping certainty, he wasn't blinking. I tried not to stare, but the longer I looked, the stranger he seemed. His skin looked too smooth, almost waxy under the firelight. His lips never parted, even as he breathed, and his eyes, too wide, too glassy, never blinked. I cleared my throat. "You out here alone?" A pause, then he smiled. "Always." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending embers swirling. My pulse thudded against my ribs. His voice, something about it. It felt empty, like he was repeating words he had heard before, not speaking them himself. "What's your name?" I asked. Another pause. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." My fingers curled around my pocket knife. "Try me." The smile stayed on his lips, but his head tilted too far to the side, like an owl adjusting its gaze. "You ever hear the story of the lost campers?" My stomach clenched. I hadn't mentioned anything about a story. He leaned in slightly, his hands resting too still on his knees. "Some say they vanish. Others say they never really leave." A gust of wind rushed through the trees. The fire flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows. His face didn't change, that eerie, unmoving grin. "You ever notice," he continued, voice barely above a whisper, "how the woods don't really want you here? The way the wind stops, the way the night listens." My throat was dry. "What do you mean?" He turned his head, not his body, just his head, toward the trees. "They don't like when people stay too long." The fire crackled. A long, stretching silence followed, then the sound. Footsteps. Not from him, from all around us, soft, shuffling movements in the trees. Dry leaves crunching, twigs snapping, coming closer. I gripped my knife tighter. My chest was rising and falling too fast. "Who else is out here?" The stranger didn't answer. He just kept smiling. And then, slowly, he lifted a hand and pointed behind me. "Look." I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I twisted in my seat, the firelight stretching just far enough to reveal shadows. Tall, still figures standing between the trees, silent, motionless, watching. My breath caught in my throat. When I spun back toward the stranger, my blood went cold. He was gone. Only his footprints remained in the dirt. But they didn't lead away. They stopped right where he had been sitting. The footsteps in the trees grew louder, and they were coming for me. I didn't think. I ran. The firelight vanished behind me as I plunged into the darkness, branches clawing at my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, not running, just moving, steady, unrelenting. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The fire still burned in the clearing, but the figures, they were stepping closer, into the glow, too tall, too thin. Their arms hung stiff at their sides, and their faces, they had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where their features should have been. And their mouths were too wide. They were smiling. My stomach lurched. I turned back, just in time to see a figure standing right in front of me. The stranger. I skidded to a stop, nearly falling backward. He was closer than he should have been, like he had just appeared there waiting for me. I gripped my knife so hard my knuckles ached. "What do you want?" My voice cracked. His head tilted at that unnatural angle again. "You already know." I took a step back. The forest felt wrong, like the air had thickened, like the trees were pressing in. My lungs struggled to pull in breath. "You invited me to your fire," he murmured. "That's all it takes, you know, just a little kindness." The figures behind me were closer now, silent, grinning, waiting. My body screamed run, but my feet wouldn't move. "Where I come from," the stranger continued, "people like you, they never leave." Something shifted in the trees. A whisper, a rustling not from wind, but from something else. The air smelled of damp earth and rot. I felt it before I saw it. Something was behind me. Cold breath ghosted over my neck. A hand, thin, boneless, closed around my wrist. I gasped, tried to yank away, but my body wouldn't respond. My vision blurred, my chest tightened, the world tilted. The last thing I saw was the stranger stepping closer, his face finally clear in the firelight. It was my face, twisted, smiling, blinking. Then darkness. The next morning, hikers found my campsite. The fire had burned out, the logs cold, but there were two sets of footprints, one leading in, none leading out. And in the dirt, right where I had been sitting, someone had carved something deep into the earth. 3 words, always one more. Camping alone had never bothered me before. I liked the quiet, the solitude. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear my head, reset. The ranger at the entrance hadn't shared my enthusiasm. "Wouldn't camp out here," he muttered as he handed me my permit. "Not this far out." I had laughed it off. "Why, bears?" His face remained blank. "Something worse." I waited for the punchline, but he just stared at me. Then he sighed and rubbed his jaw. "Just, if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer. And if you see lights between the trees, turn around." I chuckled, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "That a local ghost story or something?" He didn't smile. "Just be smart." I nodded, taking the permit. "I'll be fine." I should have listened. The first night was uneventful. My tent was pitched near a small clearing, close enough to a river that I could hear the steady trickle of water over stones. The fire burned warm, the air was crisp, and the sky was too clear, too quiet. It wasn't until I was getting into my tent that I noticed something. There were no sounds, no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, just silence. Then from the trees, a voice, soft, faint, calling my name. My stomach turned to stone. The ranger's warning came back in a rush. "If you hear someone calling your name, don't answer." I stayed frozen, my hand gripping the tent zipper. The voice came again, a little closer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. It sounded human, but wrong, too slow, like someone mimicking speech but not quite getting it right. "Help me," not my name this time. Just those two words. Help me. It was coming from the trees. I turned, heart hammering. The firelight barely reached beyond the clearing. Nothing was there, but something was watching. I could feel it. A flicker of light blinked in the distance, dim, like a lantern swaying between the trees. I wanted to believe it was another camper, a lost hiker, but I knew better. Turn around, that's what the ranger had said. So I did. I zipped my tent, lay down, and shut my eyes, ignoring the light, ignoring the voice, even when it came right outside my tent, even when I heard something breathing. I stayed silent. Eventually the voice faded, the light disappeared. I didn't sleep. I knew the warning had been real, and I knew it would come back. Morning came, but the fear didn't fade. I stepped out of my tent, half expecting to see footprints, but the ground was undisturbed. The forest looked the same as it had before, except for one thing. The fire was out. I hadn't put it out. It had been burning strong when I zipped my tent, but now the logs were cold. The ashes were undisturbed, as if the flames had just vanished. A shiver crawled up my spine. I packed my gear in record time. I wanted to believe it had just been my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. As I hiked back toward the main trail, I noticed something else. The woods were still silent. No birds, no insects, no life. That's when I saw them. The lights. At first I thought it was just sunlight catching on the trees, but as I got closer I realized they were moving. Pale orbs, swaying gently between the trunks. Not torches, not lanterns. They were floating, and they were everywhere. I gritted my teeth and walked faster, my heart slamming against my ribs. The ranger's warning rang in my head, if you see lights, turn around. But I was already surrounded. A cold, electric hum filled the air, pressing against my ears. My skin prickled as the lights drifted closer. They were no longer just flickering. They were pulsing. Then, a shadow moved between the trees. I stopped cold. It was human-shaped, tall and thin, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it wasn't walking, it was gliding. I backed away slowly, my breath shaking. Don't run. Don't look at them. But my foot snapped a twig, the figure twitched, and then it turned its head all the way around. The moment our eyes met, the lights flared, blinding and white-hot. A voice, layered and distorted, whispered through the trees. You should have left. The thing moved. I ran. The forest twisted around me, the trees stretching impossibly tall, the air thick like water. My legs burned, but the faster I ran, the closer the whispers got. I reached the trail, gasping, legs shaking. The light behind me dimmed, the whispers faded, and just like that, the forest was normal again. Birds chirped, leaves rustled. The world was as it should be, but when I looked back, the lights were still there, waiting. I wasn't safe yet, not even close. I didn't stop running. The main station was still a mile away, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The lights weren't following me anymore. They just hovered in the distance, pulsing faintly between the trees, but I knew they were watching, waiting. I forced my legs to keep moving. The forest felt different now, as if something had been disturbed. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like a damp sheet. I didn't look back again. When I finally saw the ranger station, I nearly collapsed from relief. The old wooden cabin sat at the edge of the lot, its windows glowing faintly from the inside. I stumbled up the steps, yanked the door open, and slammed it behind me. The ranger was sitting at his desk. He looked up slowly, taking in my sweat-soaked shirt, my wide eyes, my shaking hands. You saw them, didn't you? I nodded, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was that? He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. You're lucky you made it back. I swallowed hard. What are they? He shook his head. No one knows for sure. But the ones who answer the voices, the ones who follow the lights, he paused, his jaw tightening. They don't come back. My stomach twisted. I heard it right outside my tent, I whispered. The radio on his desk crackled to life, a burst of static, then a voice. My voice. Hello? The sound was distant, distorted. Is anyone there? I froze, the blood drained from my face. It was me. The exact tone, the same breathless panic I had when I ran through the trees. The ranger's face darkened. Without a word, he reached over and shut the radio off. The silence stretched. Then, after a long moment, he looked at me. You need to leave, he said quietly. I swallowed against the knot in my throat. But now, something in his expression made my skin crawl. He wasn't just telling me to leave the forest. He was telling me to leave town. I didn't argue. I turned and walked out, my legs numb. As I reached my car, I felt a shift in the air, like something had exhaled. I hesitated, then glanced back at the forest. The trees were still, the night was quiet, but just before I opened my car door, I saw them. The lights. Not in the trees anymore, closer, waiting. I didn't stay to see what would happen next. I got in my car and drove. I never went back, and I never, ever ignored a ranger's warning. Camping alone had always been my escape. No emails, no buzzing phone, just the wild, the quiet, and my own thoughts. This time, I chose a remote site deep in the woods, far from the designated campgrounds, where no one would bother me, just me, my tent, and the sound of nature. The first night was uneventful. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the trees, and the stars burned bright above me. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and let the forest lull me to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something felt off. I listened. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just a heavy, unnatural silence pressing in around me. Then, the sound. A slow, deliberate shuffling inside my tent. I went still, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was in here with me. I couldn't see anything. The tent was pitch black, but I could hear it. Soft, dragging movements just inches away from me. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands, every second stretching into eternity. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I clicked it on. Nothing. The tent was empty. I swallowed hard, scanning every inch of the small space. No footprints, no torn fabric, just me and my sleeping bag. Maybe I imagined it, maybe the wind had shifted the tent fabric. I lay back down, heart hammering, tried to sleep, but the moment I closed my eyes, a breath. Right next to my ear. I bolted upright, flashlight in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tent was still empty, but I knew then. I was never alone, and whatever was in here with me, it was still watching. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining for any sound, but the tent was silent. Too silent. I should have unzipped the flap and run, grabbed my pack, bolted to my car, and never looked back, but something held me there, a presence. I could feel it, thick, heavy, close. I forced myself to breathe slowly, in, out, tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but then the fabric of my tent shifted. Not from the wind, from the inside. I held my breath. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it at the spot where I had just seen movement. The beam landed on smooth fabric. Nothing there. I let out a shaky exhale. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe I was just... The zipper moved. My stomach plummeted. I stared as the zipper on the tent's entrance slowly slid down, inch by inch. The metal teeth parting with agonizing slowness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The tent flap peeled open. The night air didn't move, no breeze, no rustling leaves, just the open gap of the entrance. And then something crawled in, not walked, crawled. A long, slow, deliberate slither, a shape, too dark, too thin, too wrong. Moving inside, I tried to scream. Nothing came out. The thing stopped. Right at my feet. I could hear it breathing, wet, rattling, too close. My body screamed, "Run!" But when I finally found the courage to reach for the zipper, it whispered, right in my ear, "Why did you bring 2 sleeping bags?" My mind fractured. I only brought one. The flashlight flickered, and the tent went dark. Darkness swallowed me. The flashlight flickered once, then died completely. The air inside the tent felt thicker. The thing at my feet wasn't moving anymore, but I could still hear it. Breathing, wet, slow, waiting. I forced myself to move. My fingers fumbled in the pitch black, reaching for the zipper of the tent. If I could just... Something grabbed my wrist. Cold, clammy, wrong. I yanked back with all my strength, but the grip was too strong. My pulse pounded in my skull, my lungs locked. The whisper came again, right next to my ear. "You let me in." I threw myself toward the entrance, scrambling, clawing at the zipper. My hand shook so badly I could barely grip the metal pull. The thing behind me shifted. The tent fabric groaned as something too big, too twisted moved inside. I ripped the zipper down. The cold air rushed in. I dove out, tumbling onto the dirt, my hands and knees scraping against the ground. And I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran. Branches lashed against my arms. The forest was no longer silent. The wind howled through the trees, but underneath it I heard something worse. Laughter. Low, wheezing, gurgling, coming from the open tent. I didn't slow. I sprinted down the trail, barely able to see in the dark, my feet slipping on loose earth. My only thought was, get to the car. Get out. Don't stop. When I finally reached the lot, I yanked the door open, dove inside, and locked it. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the trail behind me. The tent was still there. The flap hung open, empty. But just before I slammed the car into reverse, I saw it. A shape. Tall, thin, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching. I didn't stay to see more. I peeled out of the lot, tires kicking up gravel, heart hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. The road blurred around me as I sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. By the time I reached the highway, the sky was turning gray with the first light of morning. I should have felt safe, but I didn't, and I had never touched it.